Hello, and welcome to the Frequency of Genius 360 interviews. I'm your host, Richard Sachs, and this hour we're going to be introducing David Wolfe. David, how did you get into raw foods?
Well, I've always had a strong predilection towards raw foods from the time I was a child. I didn't realize that it was raw foods that I was specifically attracted to, and I didn't really realize that would be a calling for me in my life, but I've always eaten a lot of fruit, especially when I was a kid. I ate a lot of oranges, grew up on a citrus fruit orchard, and I also ate a lot of avocados as a kid. I think more than most people in the Western world anyway, because I was raised most of my life on an avocado farm. Anyway, when I was about 19 years old, I started realizing I had dairy allergies and I had some kind of a reaction to dairy products. And so I stopped consuming dairy products at that time. But everybody asked me, where are you going to get your calcium for your bones? And I started getting those kinds of questions. And I thought, I better start researching nutrition. And that began a 5-year journey, which eventually landed me into raw food nutrition somewhere around 1993 or thereabouts. And I've been a raw food enthusiast ever since.
So folks that are listening are probably wondering, when you change your diet, especially going from, like, say, eating meat and all the dairy and so forth, what can one expect typically of changing to a more vegan or raw food diet?
Well, there's all kinds of effects that can occur. One of the effects is you can have a substantial detoxification or outgassing of old toxic debris and sludge that was never really digested properly. You can have a release of all kinds of things out of your skin, out of your urine, out of your bowels, out of your breath. And so that's the ugly part. The other part is you can have an absurd rejuvenation of your whole consciousness and your whole body so that you become completely renewed and remade. And it's a dynamic interaction between those two states of being, because when you start on a program of eating raw foods and juices and detoxification protocols and even colonics and the whole 9 yards, what ends up happening is you have it one day where you feel like you're the greatest thing on earth. You feel better than you ever felt, even when you were 16 years old or even when you were 5. And then the next day you feel awful. It's just kind of this revolving door until we churn out all the garbage. And there is a lot of garbage. People say, no, there's not. Well, 75,000 artificial chemicals have been dumped into the environment since 1940. So that gives you kind of an idea of what we're dealing with. And interestingly enough, in this whole debate about cancer, what's never talked about in the mainstream media is the cause being related to these 75,000 different artificial chemicals we've dumped into the environment, including, by the way, radioactive debris. And radioactive uranium, plutonium, polonium, and cesium are in the environment. And we are being affected by these things, even if we don't realize it. I met a guy who was in the military and literally had a thyroid disease because of his exposure to depleted uranium weapons. Didn't even know they were dangerous, was never told by the military that they were dangerous. So this is kind of what we're dealing with. We're not told that these things are dangerous, even though they are. And then we have to come to a realization that we have to then assume responsibility totally for our own protection and our family's own protection from these toxic substances.
When folks are starting out in superfoods, as you can imagine, changing the diet and so forth, they're overwhelmed. Do you have any suggestions for those people?
I think the best strategy is to always do what you're familiar with. I grew up on sandwiches. I grew up on cereal in the morning. I grew up on snacks in the afternoon and then a big dinner at night. So you take those same patterns and you simply upgrade them, like upgrading your operating system. We're not using the same operating system on our computers that existed 20 years ago. We've upgraded, and we've all got to upgrade now based on our current situation. If we do nothing, we're going to end up in trouble, as our parents are ending up in trouble, our grandparents have ended up in trouble in terms of hospitals, doctors' bills, surgeries, cancers, and the list goes on, chronic inflammatory pain. So we've got to do something. What we do is we just take what we already know, what we're familiar with, and we just upgrade. We get off that, say, wheat bread. Let's say we start on white bread. We go to wheat bread. Let's say we want to go up from there. We get on from wheat bread, we go to 7-grain bread. From 7-grain bread, we go to Ezekiel bread. From Ezekiel bread, we go to flax and chia crackers and some of these raw food breads that are out there that are actually sproutable. I've actually thrown flax crackers out the window of my house, and they sprouted and grew. I mean, amazing. Whoa, it is living food. And that's a good way to start so that we can, say, upgrade our sandwich idea so that we're using flax and chia crackers. We could still have the same great sandwich, have all the great goodies in there, sprouts, and I like to have a lot of combination of coconut butter and honey as kind of a mayonnaise, which is really nice. I like to have a lot of avocado on there. I like to have a really nice layer of lettuce and tomato and a little bit of onion and maybe even like a slice of cucumber in there. And boom, you got your same kind of idea as you had before, which is your sandwich, but it's a whole different effect on your body because there's no side effects. And it actually, the energy of raw and living foods begins to actually start detoxifying us of all the debris from before. A lot of this, as you know, Richard, is experiential. You've got to start wherever you are and just see what happens. We are all survivors of a nutritional holocaust, an unbelievable disaster of chemistries that we have no idea what they are.
We find that the young people, and in particular, the 20-something and the teenagers, they have issue with how expensive superfoods are and switching over to the more expensive foods. And these kids are really like, they're die hard. They want to make the change and they're excited, but it's one of a financial. Can you kind of give them suggestions or solutions to that?
Great question. Excellent. Well, this is where we have two directions to go. I think number one, the first thing I want to mention is that these kids, because they're so passionate, they need to learn about becoming entrepreneurial. And they could call up any one of these superfood companies and say, hey, I want to distribute your product and buy 12 instead of 1 at a substantial discount, and then sell the rest to their friends also at a discount and start their own little business. So that the price comes down, because if you buy as a business, it's different than buying as a consumer. So that's one step. The second step is getting it into that stage in our mind where we're more in a prosperity consciousness. You know, people say, I don't have any money for this, but, you know, meanwhile, they pay their rent. They have money for that. And I don't have any money for whatever, but meanwhile, they pay their car payment. So what's more important, your rent, your car, or you? And the answer is you. You're more important. You're actually the creator of your car. You're the creator of the ability to be able to rent a place. And we've got to start focusing on bringing in abundance into our body and get out of this cheap kind of American model of, I got to have it cheaper, because the thing about superfoods is they're the real deal and they're not cheap. And that's just the way it is. Out of this, like, I got to have it cheaper, because the cheapness is what creates slavery in the third world. Is like, oh, no, I got to get it cheaper. I got to get it lower price. Got to get cheaper. What ends up happening is the farmer loses out at the very bottom of the chain.
That is so true. Those are excellent suggestions. I think we should back up a minute and define superfoods for those listeners that are not familiar. David, you've been in this for quite some time. How do you define superfoods? Because there's a lot of misinformation out there that, it's a racket, it's a scam, it's this, it's that. Can you define what a superfood is?
A superfood is the greatest food that was ever identified by any given civilization. For example, the Chinese identified the goji berry as their greatest thing that they had in their pharmacopoeia of 4,000, 5,000 years of history, 8,000 food herbs, which is pretty significant. I mean, when you get to those numbers, you got to start looking at that going, okay, maybe they figured something out. A big problem coming into raw and living foods and superfoods is that people are jaded. Our whole civilization is so screwed up in the way that we're educated. We're obviously massively undernourished. We don't even understand what a prosperity consciousness is. We think that everybody's out to get us. We're into conspiracies of every sort. We just got to drop that mental chatter and get on to like what's real. Okay, aloe vera was given to us by the Egyptians. Out of all the things that they had figured out in their agriculture over their thousands of years of history of that civilization, they bring us aloe vera. Another one is cacao, raw chocolate, which was brought to us by the great civilizations of Central America. In fact, arguably the greatest civilization that's ever existed in the history of the world. When you think about the Mayans and the Aztecs and the Toltecs and what eventually became the nation of Mexico and Mexico City, which was the biggest city in the world when Cortez and his cronies showed up there in 1521, 3 times bigger than any city in Europe. And what did they use as their primary medicine, their primary food, their form of currency, raw cacao or chocolate. And these are foods that are holy and they're sacred. We could say the same about maca in the Andes, the great lost crop of the Incas, which is a super invigorator. They used to use that as money. In fact, they used to trade it into the jungle for cacao. They'd send maca down the Andes and bring cacao back up. These foods have not only the science behind them, and this is all detailed, by the way, in my book, Superfoods, the Food Medicine of the Future, but they also have the legends, the lore, the history. They are time-proven beyond any food that we have today. People say, no, I don't eat superfoods, and then they go eat pumpkin seeds from the health food store. Those pumpkin seeds at the health food store are the Lady Godiva cultivar of pumpkin seeds that are shell-less pumpkin seeds. They have no natural shell, and they're a hybrid. They were developed in 1973 and released into the U.S. market in 1974. Well, when you're dealing with maca, you're dealing with something that was released into the market 6,000 or 7,000 years ago. You see the difference there? And you see how silly it gets when we really start looking at this, because there's so many arguments. Oh, no, I can't afford this because of whatever it is. And it's just made up. You know, the whole thing is made up. You can afford to pay your rent. You can afford to pay your car payment. You can't afford to give your body the best food ever. And you can't afford to give your body real food instead of, say, a hybridized cucumber, hybridized watermelon, hybridized seedless orange, hybridized seedless apple. You know, the standard fare of a health food store, which in my almost 20 years of experience and over 20 years of experience in the health food store world, but nearly 20 years of experience as a professional in the health field, there's no way you can get enough nutrition from standard fare bought at a health food store, even if it's organic. No way.
So, David, what is considered in your mind, again, with your vast amount of knowledge in nutrition and so forth, is there a perfect diet?
No, there's no perfect diet for everybody. There may be a perfect diet for you, which is part of your endowment in your life that you're supposed to figure out as part of the riddle of your life, riddle of your existence. What is the ideal diet for you? And then activate that diet so you can achieve mastery in your life. A diet isn't about losing weight, or it isn't about having muscle or any of that. It's about achieving mastery. It's about transforming your body into a vehicle and a vessel to achieve your goals. To me, then, there is no amount of money that will stop me from accessing the best foods ever. I will pay whatever I have to pay to get the best foods ever for my body, just like people pay the tons of cash, I mean, unbelievable amounts of cash for cars, houses, and things they think are important, which really aren't important compared to your physical body, which is the super vehicle, your genetic spacesuit.
But what do you say to those people, David, that have like the viruses and the bacteria, and their body has overtaken the viruses and bacteria and so forth, and their emotions have overtaken basically, the fact that, hey, I want to get healthier, I want to get better, but gee whiz, I'll go ahead and do raw food, and then a week later I'm back to eating my donuts. Can you speak to those kind of folks?
Well, I think it's a trial of will. I mean, it's a trial of motivation. These situations where people are flipping back and forth, it's a trial of consciousness. Like, which reality do you want to live in? Do you want to live in kind of the conventional, distorted television land reality that says that the world is this? You know, it's politics and banking and all of that kind of stuff. And do you want to also transform yourself and say that the world actually, no, the world is this. It's one that's enchanted. It's one that's beautiful. It's one that is healthy. It's one that's a state of awe. It's one that inspires the miraculous. Because we've been buried in litigation. We've been buried in legislation. We've been buried in taxes. We've been buried in BS and lies by governments. We've been buried in totally ridiculous ways of life. And it's all been fed by that food that we were eating. From the Lucky Charms and Fruity Pebbles all the way to the fried chicken, all the way to the hamburgers and milkshakes. So we have to decide, like, hey, which one do we want? And it's okay either way. If we decide, hey, the burgers is what we want, then go, take that, but don't be naive and assume that you are what you eat is going to be overcome, because it's not. You are what you eat is not going to be overcome. It's not going to be overcome by me, by you, or anybody. That phrase will be here till the end of time. And we were probably given that phrase when we were emailed to the planet by God, when we were conceived. And that's the zip file. You open up that file, whoa, watch out. You are what you eat is profound. And the superfood revolution, the raw food revolution, the super herb revolution, and the living spring water revolution are about recapturing our soul so that we can really come alive in our body and experience the majesty of living instead of just getting by, instead of stomach aches, instead of headaches, instead of aches and pains, which are totally irrational. I mean, there's no reason we should ever suffer from any of those things. In fact, a cold, a flu, a cough, a fever, any of that stuff is crazy based on where we are with our technology and our understanding. We don't need to suffer like that. Let's get out of suffering. Let's get into joy and health. And those things begin with diet, which is number one. It's more important than exercise.
When you look at our ancestors, David, you'll notice that, several hundred years ago, perhaps, they were eating an indigenous, diet to their area, but yet they died at 30 and 40 years old. And they didn't have GM food and they didn't have factory farmed animals. So can you speak to that kind of oddness that when you look back, they say that people are living longer, which to me, I don't know if I don't think that's true. But my question is specific: is that when we look back several hundred years ago at our ancestors, they were eating the what would be considered, I guess, a superfood diet. Correct me if I'm wrong. Can you speak to the fact that they didn't live too long, though? What's going on?
I think that's total propaganda, 100% propaganda. If you just factor out infant death mortality rate, which is your first year of life, if you make it past the first year, we're not living any longer than we ever have. The only thing we've been able to do in the modern world is actually get the infant death mortality rate down. That's the only improvement we've actually seen in our world. We also can say that there's been some sanitation improvements. But if you look at the great books of literature written on longevity back 150 years ago, 180 years ago, 125 years ago, the stuff that I originally picked up when I first started studying at the Price Pottenger Nutrition Foundation, when I first got a hold of Health Research's catalog, you will see that actually from about 1600 to about 1800 in the Western world, extraordinary longevity was achieved because a number of things came to light. One was the importance of sanitation. Two was the ability to acquire learning and information to increase our level of inspiration and our desire to stay here on the planet. Three, the herbal pharmacopoeias became more widely available to the population. So there's a number of recorded cases in all the major countries of the world of extreme longevity in that period of time because there was all the right factors and no industrial technology to pollute everything. So we should have seen an explosion in longevity, which we actually did see. I'm thinking of cases that were cited by DeLacy Evans in his books. I'm thinking of Hilton Hotima and the cases that were cited in his books. I'm thinking of the great Chinese Taoist immortals and their stories, and the great Vedic yogi immortals and their stories. And when I say immortals, I'm talking about people who live to be over 100 years old. Because if you make it over 100, that's pretty good. And I think it's all propaganda. That's my strong feeling. We're not living longer. We're dying longer. The whole thing's a scam.
Very interesting insight in that, because there's so much misinformation that you just addressed and cleared up for a lot of people, I'm sure. I want to change the subject just slightly a little bit. When we look at farming and the way we farm and the practices that we use, they're clearly not sustainable. And I want to bring up Rudolf Steiner, and I wanted to get your feedback into Rudolf Steiner's thoughts of how best to grow food and so forth, and also if you could comment on the way we grow food. Okay.
I do want to say this, that there are many, many different systems of understanding nature. And you asked me a very good question one time when I met you outside of Asheville, North Carolina, and you asked me how many forces are there? And the answer is unknown. There are so many forces that we do not understand. It's ridiculous. And the same could be said with farming systems, that work. There are numerous farming strategies that work, that are sustainable, that are great, but they're different from each other. They work on different principles because Mother Nature will not require us to carve her up into one system. She presents us numerous different ways with which to master her riddles, right? So there's many ways to home, not just one. And Rudolf Steiner presented us his perspective, which is institutionalized now as biodynamic farming. And those 8 lectures that he gave back, I believe it was in 1921, could have been 1923 or thereabouts, that gave us biodynamic farming are a distillation of different forces that get concentrated in different areas of the plant, mineral, and animal kingdoms. And he brings those forces together in unique ways to create different preparations that you spray on your crops in order to inspire growth. And it works. I mean, there has been 80 years of research now, 90 years of research indicating that Rudolf Steiner's biodynamic method of farming is absolutely amazing, and it works. I've been using it just today. I had a little bit of mold, like a mildewy stuff, getting onto some of my goji berries and some of my astragalus in my greenhouse. And I went and sprayed them with horsetail tea. So I made some horsetail tea, brewed that up yesterday morning, poured that when it cooled down into a spray bottle, and went and sprayed the mildew, because horsetail tea, according to Rudolf Steiner, is an absolute death sentence to mildew and mold. So I not only have learned that from using Rudolf Steiner's methods that it works, but I also found out something else from not only my own research, but other people told me this, that when you do this, when you spray horsetail tea on plants, maybe you do it a couple times, they become permanently resistant to mildew and mold. It actually gets into the genetics of the plant and changes things around. So even if they're deliberately exposed to mildew and mold, they will permanently change and become resistant at some kind of genetic level.
David, is that true? Is that true of roses, David?
Yes, that's what you use on your roses is horsetail tea, correct.
Wow, that's awesome.
And that's one of Rudolf Steiner's insights in his biodynamic farming system. If I can go further, I'd love to, because I love to talk about this stuff. Another one of the great insights was to concentrate earth forces using a cow horn. And Rudolf Steiner, in his treatises on agriculture, and you can get all those 8 lectures in one book, it's just called Agriculture by Rudolf Steiner, he differentiates between the cow and the deer, because we're basically a cow-eating civilization. The Native Americans were a deer-eating civilization. They lived off deer. Native Americans lived on deer. That was their main form of meat. But we're cow. So what does that have to do with our consciousness? Well, a lot, because cows are very telluric. They're very earth-centered. They're very heavy and on the ground. They're very stuck on the ground, whereas a deer is very flight of foot and moves very rapidly. It has a very interesting relationship with the cosmos rather than the earth. And if you've ever heard deer galloping through the forest, it's a whole lot different than a stampede of steer and cow. Anyway, the horn of the cow is a concentrator of those telluric or earth energy forces. So what Rudolf Steiner described was you take cow dung and you put it in the hollow of the horn, and you do that with like 100 horns. Then you bury that for the winter. Then you dig it up in the spring. You take all that material that was in the horn, because that horn is a concentrator of those earth energies. The horns are in the earth. Those are then concentrating into the manure. You then take that manure, you stir it both clockwise and counterclockwise into a barrel for an hour, and then you take that material and you spray it over your whole farm. Now you would think, oh what the hell is that going to do? I mean, come on. But it actually does miraculous things. And I've done it here on my farm. A friend of mine actually prepared the material down at his farm and then gave me the concentrate of it, and I sprayed it around. It's darn amazing. I mean, how did he know that? And the answer is through his super sensibility intuition. He channeled it, basically, and it works. And so we got to start paying attention to some of these materials that are channeled, not necessarily through the scientific method, but they are natural and they do work, but they come from other aspects of our consciousness, not just the scientific method.
So are you at Noni Land presently?
No, I'm actually at my farm here in Ontario, Canada.
I see. We started doing raised beds and growing our own food. And I understand that you got into growing your own food too. Can you give us your own personal insight into like what you're growing? Because I understand that you grow some interesting things like tobacco and chocolate. And I think that everybody would find it fascinating who's listening.
I got into growing plants years and years ago because I was inspired by my friend Don Weaver and his research on rock dust and how important it is to get the rock dusts back into the soil so we can have more minerals in our food. I was excited about having food that had more minerals in it and about growing that food. So on both counts, I jumped into it just as soon as I could. Like literally when I first rented a place in San Diego that had a backyard, and I started throwing all the compost out the window, and a bunch of things started coming up and growing. And I realized how much food I could grow instead of paying for it, which, by the way, is another solution. If somebody's going, I can't afford this, I can't afford that, grow the food. Grow it yourself. Grow it on your balcony. Grow it in your windowsill. Grow it in your little backyard. Grow it in your big backyard. Grow it in your front yard. Start growing these things. Every bag of goji berries that's out there contains seeds. You can take those seeds out, sprout them, and they sprout. And grow goji berries. Grow them yourself. And that's really the ultimate message of all this stuff. I mean, I've been responsible for shipping hundreds of thousands of bags of goji berries around the world. I'm not doing that just for a bag of goji berries going around the world. I'm doing that so that seeds are being deposited in various corners of the world. For anybody who's listening closely, I think you'll see what I mean. And the same could be said with the Incan berries and other raw foods that I've distributed. I mean, that's why I distribute raw foods, so that these seeds can go far and wide. And maybe one day somebody snaps out of the kind of, hallucination of magazines, newspapers, and television and suddenly goes, whoa, wait a second, this may be valuable, and begins to start growing the food themselves. If you would have asked me 15 years ago, what do you think of tobacco, I would have laughed. But somehow, due to my exposure to shamanic practices in North America, Central America, and South America, and meeting shamans all over the world, and just the overall power of some of the places that I've been to, like Eden Hot Springs, Arizona, I got into growing exotic varieties of tobacco. It's a hobby now. So I'm an exotic tobacco grower. Mostly I grow them for their beauty and their flowers. I mean, I love it. It's absolutely amazing. In fact, I have in my greenhouse here, and actually I usually have it in the yard every year I grow it, a tobacco variety that came out of a tomb that I recently found out was actually near my house here in Ontario, Canada, and was dormant in that tomb for 1,000 years. And we sprouted those seeds and grew them here. And they're growing even now. I'm on my fourth generation, actually, of those seeds that we've now done that for 4 years in a row. So now I've got my own kind of version of that particular unique cultivar. And it's a hobby. It's a wonderful hobby because I can feed myself. I can grow very exotic, interesting plants. I can learn about how nature hides its secrets. I can discover aspects of the mysteries of growth. It's all consuming. It's amazing. I believe strongly, by the way, Richard, that anybody out there who's recommending any herb should also grow that herb. Anybody is out there recommending any superfood should also grow that superfood. Anybody's out there recommending any raw food should also grow that raw food, because there's a whole body of information you get from growing it and understanding its very unique and special personality and how that relates to healing and well-being that we cannot get just simply from taking the herb or the food or the superfood.
I think, David, a lot of people will certainly get what you're saying. They might be perplexed, though, as to the folks out there that are uninitiated or unfamiliar with tobacco. They might think that, okay, why is David growing something that is cancer causing? Could you maybe dispel that disinformation about tobacco, perhaps?
I finally got it down to just a couple phrases, Richard, and here it is. Tobacco doesn't cause cancer. It never has. If you go down to the Amazon and you hang out with the shamans down there, which I have done, I hung out with a shaman down there, 85 years of age, who'd been smoking tobacco nonstop since he was 12. He looked great. He looked amazing. In fact, tobacco in its natural state if people are smoking it like he does, it is actually a longevity tonic. Do the research on that and you'll find out it's true, that the longest lived people in the world are tobacco smokers. Now, I'm not recommending that anybody smoke tobacco. I mean, you don't need to, and it's kind of old news. However, this idea that tobacco causes cancer is not the real truth. The real truth is it's the chemicals that are added to the delivery system called nicotine, which is niacin, which is the dilator of all your capillaries, pretty much a dilator of all the tissues in your body. That is the cancer-causing mechanism. There are 4,000 chemicals being added to chemical tobacco today, like conventional cigars, conventional cigarette packets, and even American Spirit is something's wrong with it. As a tobacco grower and it's a hobby that I do, I can tell you for sure something's wrong with American Spirit. I don't know what that stuff is. I don't know what they're doing to it. I have an idea. I bet you they're spraying it with chelated nicotine. I bet you they're flue drying it very fast, so the sugar content's much higher. But it causes nausea and headaches and all kinds of problems. People who smoke that stuff. That has nothing to do with tobacco. Tobacco itself is